Hey guys, we're experiencing a heat wave. I want to quickly talk about some of the health risks that we don't often think about that we can experience when we're in a heat wave like this. In a country like Canada, we often worry about the extreme cold, and when we have really cold weather events, what happens to people who are homeless? And indeed, those are the people who are most vulnerable and who sometimes can die from that extreme cold. But the opposite is true with extreme heat events. If you think back to the BC heat dome from last year, 98% of the people who died in that heat wave actually died indoors. Many of those people were over 70, many had chronic diseases, and many of those people, actually most of those people, lived alone. And you can imagine that scenario where an elderly person who lives alone and doesn't have air conditioning is in an environment that's gradually warming up. And once they're in a situation where they become hyperthermic, where they sort of reach that hyperthermia threshold, which is defined by a core body temperature of 40 or higher, they start to lose their ability to actually process things. That's when you get into agitation, confusion, seizures, and eventually the body starts shutting down as your temperature goes above that. So they may reach a point where they're not even aware of what's happening to them, and they don't have the wherewithal to actually reach out for help. So if you know somebody who lives alone and doesn't have air conditioning, encourage them to preemptively go to one of those cooling centers. And there are these cooling centers basically in every city because we are facing so many of these heat waves where they can be in an air-conditioned environment. And if you're indoors, make sure that you draw the drapes, keep that radiant heat out of the home. If you're outdoors, avoid wearing a lot of layers, which keep you hot. Avoid being in the sun, so avoid that direct heat of the sun. Avoid exercising, which also increases your core body temperature. And for all of us, just really be aware of the temperature and the humidex. And if the humidity actually passes 75%, that's when our bodies have a harder time staying cool, because the main mechanism we have to stay cool is actually sweating. And the evaporation of that sweat, which takes heat with it, becomes a lot less effective when the humidity out there is 75%. And so that's when the risk goes up. And finally, be really aware of the risk of dehydration in this kind of heat. So remember, keep hydrated, particularly if you're active in any way in this kind of heat. So these next few days are going to be really hot. So think about yourself, your own risks, but particularly the risk to those vulnerable people around you.